You attacked humanity. The Galactic Senate went deathly silent. The earpiece crackled twice before the voice on the other end dissolved into static. I pressed 2 fingers against it and kept my face perfectly still. Around me, 419 alien delegates were applauding. I was the only human in the room. My name is Maravas. I have spent 11 years as humanity's liaison to the Galactic Senate, which means I have spent 11 years learning how to smile when I want to scream. It is not a talent you are born with. It is something you build slowly, the way you build a wall, 1 stone at a time, placed carefully, so nothing falls through the cracks. The Senate chamber on Velcara Prime is a beautiful room. I say that now because I want you to understand what it felt like to stand in it, and beauty is part of that picture. The ceiling is 300 meters high, made from a crystalline material the Valkyrie quarried from their moon, and when the overhead lights hit it at certain angles, the whole room shimmers like the inside of a deep ocean cave. The floor is black polished stone, perfectly level, and the delegates sit in tiered arcs that rise from the central podium like the rings of a small amphitheater. Everything about the architecture is designed to make the being at the podium feel seen. Surrounded. Accountable. I watched Consul Veth standing there and thought, you have no idea what you have done. The Dravery ambassador was a tall creature with pale silver skin that caught the light the same way the ceiling did, all shine, very little depth. His face had 4 narrow eyes arranged vertically, one above the other, which gave him the permanent expression of someone watching several things at once without fully focusing on any of them. His name was Consul Veth, and he had been speaking for 23 minutes about something he called a necessary correction. The Senate gallery had listened with the polite, slightly bored attention they always gave to species with large fleets and long histories of territorial complaint. I had listened too. I had listened to every syllable. The necessary correction, it turned out, was this: the Dravery Collective had launched a coordinated military strike against 18 human colonial settlements located along the Outer Corridor, a chain of agricultural and transit worlds that humanity had been developing for 60 years. They had done it without warning, without any formal declaration of hostility, and without informing the Galactic Senate until after the operation was already complete. Consul Veth described it as a strategic preemption. He said humanity had been expanding too quickly, too boldly, into regions that the Dravery Collective had historically considered within their sphere of influence. He noted that no Dravery had lived in the Outer Corridor for over 3,000 years, but framed this as irrelevant because cultural memory of space transcended occupation. He said the settlements had represented a provocation that required a response. He used the word response 4 times. Not attack. Not strike. Response. Then he sat down, and the applause began. Not every delegate clapped. The Velkari observer, a composed woman named Counselor Peth, sat with her 4 hands folded in her lap and her eyes on the floor. The Murith representative looked at the ceiling. The Lethani elder, old and pale at the back of the gallery, was completely motionless. But enough delegates made enough noise to fill a chamber that size, and Consul Veth absorbed it with the particular satisfaction of someone who had spent a long time planning a moment and was now inside it. I sat in the human observation tier. This is a small, glass-paneled balcony positioned at the far left of the gallery level, assigned to humanity when we were first admitted to the Senate as a junior member species. The balcony was designed to keep us visible without granting us floor access. I had occupied that seat for 6 years and registered 0 formal complaints about its location, because complaining about your chair is not the same as changing your position. I did not complain now either. What I did was tilt my head slightly, press 2 fingers to my earpiece, and listen to what was coming through. It was breaking apart. Transmission interference from the Senate's comm shielding protocols. We were not supposed to receive external signals during open session. I had modified my earpiece receiver slightly, over the years, to pick up emergency band frequencies through the shielding. This was not strictly permitted. I had decided, a long time ago, that there are rules you follow because they protect people, and rules you follow because they protect systems, and those 2 categories are not the same thing. What was coming through the emergency band was a distress broadcast from Kepler Station. Kepler was the largest of the 18 settlements. It was not a military installation. It was a transit hub and farming colony built over 60 years by families who had accepted land grants from the Earth government in exchange for developing agricultural infrastructure and new systems. At the time of the strike, Kepler's population was 4,200,000 people. Families. farmers, teachers, mechanics. Children born on a world they had never thought of as temporary. The station's power grid and life support infrastructure had been targeted in the first wave of the strike, a deliberate operational choice, because destroying life support in a sealed habitat colony does not require a second wave. It simply requires patience. 4 million people were now in a sealed environment with failing air recyclers, no incoming supply ships, no rescue corridor, and communication bandwidth so overwhelmed by distress signals that individual voices were drowning each other out. My hand did not shake. I had learned a great deal about keeping my hands still. The Senate President, Councillor Oren, a broad-shouldered Keth with the deliberate voice of someone who had been managing difficult rooms for most of his life, called for order as the applause faded. He asked if any member wished to formally respond to Consul Veth's address. I stood up. There was a moment of surprise in the room. Not shock, I was permitted to speak during open sessions, even from the observation tier. But something about the pace of it. The way I rose slowly, without urgency, as though I had been expecting this moment and had decided exactly where to put my weight when I got to my feet. Commander Voss, Councillor Oren said. You have the floor for a standard period of 5 minutes. Thank you, I said. My voice came out completely level. I would like to decline. Another ripple. Several delegates looked at each other. You decline to speak, Oren asked, with careful neutrality. I decline to respond on behalf of humanity at this time, I said. I believe someone else will speak for us very soon. And they will be considerably more specific than I could be. Consul Veth's 4 eyes moved to me with the expression of someone waiting to be impressed by something small. I reached into the breast pocket of my jacket and removed a compact comm relay. Standard issue diplomatic equipment, the kind we use to patch external feeds into Senate chambers during emergency briefings. I had carried the device into every session for 6 years. I had never activated it before. I set it on the ledge of the observation tier, in front of my chair, and pressed the activation switch. The sound that filled the chamber was not what anyone in that room was prepared for. It was a voice. A Dravery voice, high and clipped, speaking in military command dialect. The Senate's translation system processed it in under a second. The voice was saying, "They are not retreating. I need command to understand this." I fired 3 full volley sequences and they are still advancing. They are not pulling back, they are not decelerating, they are not requesting communication. They are advancing. Why are they advancing? Why are they not retreating? Someone explain to me why they are not retreating. The applause that had filled the chamber 90 seconds ago did not exist anymore. Nothing existed in that room except that voice, crackling through emergency frequencies from somewhere along the outer corridor, where a Dravery border admiral had apparently encountered something that did not fit inside any model he had been trained to use. I let it run for 14 seconds. Then I switched it off. I have nothing further to add at this time, I said, and sat back down. Councillor Oren looked at me for a long moment. Consul Veth looked at me. 417 alien delegates looked at me from across the chamber, from the gallery and the floor and the auxiliary viewing platforms, and I looked back at all of them with the same expression I had been building for 11 years. The session recess was called 19 minutes later. It was the fastest recess I had ever witnessed in the Galactic Senate, and I had been paying attention to recesses for a long time. I stayed in my chair after the room emptied. The earpiece was quieter now, the signal was more fragmented, which either meant the interference was worsening or the source was moving. I could not tell which. I would not have full information for several hours, and I had learned over the years that waiting for full information is one of the most important skills a person in my position can develop. Not because acting without information is always wrong, but because the information you receive after the first wave of events tells you things the first wave cannot. A young aide from the Valkyrie Observer's office approached the balcony. She was holding her data pad with both hands, which was a sign of anxiety in Valkyrie body language. Their secondary grip reflex activates under stress. She could not have been more than 25 in standard years. "Commander Voss," she said, with careful formality. "The observer would like to know if there is anything the Valkyrie delegation can do." I considered the question. "Please tell the observer that I am grateful for the offer," I said. "And tell her that what happens next will not be comfortable for anyone in this building. I want her to know that is not humanity's preference." It is humanity's response to someone else's preference. The aide absorbed this. She nodded, once, and walked away quickly. I turned back to the empty Senate floor. The chairs were vacant. The podium lights had dimmed to standby level. Somewhere at the far end of the chamber, a maintenance unit was moving quietly along the back wall, doing whatever it was designed to do, completely indifferent to everything that had just happened in this room. Consul Veth had wanted to send a message. He had sent a very clear one. The problem, the single, catastrophic problem with his entire calculation, was that he had not understood who he was sending it to. 4 million people. I sat with that number the way you sit with a weight you are carrying and cannot set down, not in grief, not in panic, but with the deliberate awareness of what it means. 4 million people was not a statistic. It was a school on every corridor of a station that took 6 hours to walk end to end. It was a market district that smelled like soil and metal and the particular kind of food that only exists when people from 100 different places on Earth decide to cook next to each other for long enough to start sharing. It was a hospital where a woman named Eleanor Briggs had delivered over 4,000 children in 20 years, and every one of those children had a name, and every name was currently in a sealed structure with failing air. The Senate placed me under what Counselor Oren called protective observation 41 minutes after the session recess. 2 Velkari security officers appeared at the door of the observation tier and explained, with genuine courtesy, that for my safety and the stability of the diplomatic situation, I would be provided quarters inside the Senate complex and asked to remain available for consultation. They were polite about every word of it. I recognized the arrangement for what it was. A hostage does not have to be in chains. A hostage just has to be close enough to reach. I went with them without argument. There was no productive alternative, and I had a great deal of thinking to do, and a comfortable room with a monitored comm terminal was at least as good a place to do it as the observation balcony. The quarters were clean and quiet, with a wide window that looked out over the Senate gardens, carefully maintained green spaces that the Velkari had installed when they built this complex, because their species found open vegetation psychologically stabilizing. The fountain in the central garden was running. I watched it for a while and tried to remember the last time I had seen anything that calm. I sent a status update to the Human Diplomatic Corps from the terminal. In custody, Senate stabilizing, fleet signal received, standing by. Short, factual, no interpretation. Then I closed the terminal and lay on the bed and stared at the ceiling and thought about what the Senate believed it had by keeping me here, and what it actually had. What it believed it had was leverage. A human official close enough to negotiate with, visible enough to demonstrate a commitment to diplomatic resolution, reachable enough to be consulted before any further escalation. This was sound institutional thinking. It was how you manage a crisis involving a junior member species. What it actually had was a person who had been sitting in a glass balcony watching the Galactic Senate treat humanity as a manageable inconvenience for 11 years, and who had long since stopped being surprised by the gap between what institutions believe and what is true. The next morning, Counselor Oren arrived with 2 senior advisors. One was a Keth named Secretary Dolan, thin, careful, the kind of official who had clearly spent decades being useful to people with more power than him. The other I did not recognize by name, a broad female Velkari whose badge indicated she served on the Senate's Crisis Resolution Committee. They sat across from me. I offered water. They declined. I had expected that. Commander Voss, Oren said, with the directness of someone who has decided that directness is now the most efficient approach, the Senate does not endorse the Dravery Collective's actions. The strikes were conducted without mandatory advance notification to this body, which constitutes a clear violation of Protocol Article 41, subsection C. I am aware of Article 41, I said. We are treating the violation seriously. I know you are, I paused. May I show you something? I pulled up the historical archive on my personal data pad, not patched through any Senate system, not accessible to any monitoring protocol they might have running. Just my own device, loaded before I entered the complex. I set it on the table so both of them could see the screen. The display showed a timeline. It covered 214 years of documented human conflict, every engagement, large or small, that had involved human forces either on Earth or in space. The incidents were marked as small points on the line. There were a great many points. These are every significant military engagement involving human forces since we first left our home system, I said. Would you like to know what they all have in common? Dolan and Oren looked at the screen, then at each other. They all ended, I said. Every single one. Some because one side achieved their objective. Some because negotiation produced a settlement. Some because one side simply lost the physical capacity to continue. Every conflict on this list has a start date and an end date. I let that land. What this timeline cannot tell you is how long any individual conflict lasted. That information is in a separate column. I scrolled to show the duration data. Dolan leaned forward slightly. His expression was the particular kind of careful that people wear when they are about to say something they hope will not make things worse. Commander Voss, the Dravery Collective has a fleet capacity that is substantial, I agreed. Yes. They have 6,000 years of spacefaring history. Their production infrastructure is deeply established. Their tactical doctrine is well developed. I set the data pad down. Can I ask you something, Secretary Dolan? Of course. Humanity has had space travel for 214 years. In that time, we have colonized 43 star systems, built a standing navy of 12,000 commissioned warships, and apparently become alarming enough that a 6,000-year-old civilization decided to attack our farming settlements to slow us down. I kept my voice level. What does that rate of development tell you about what the next 200 years look like? Neither of them answered immediately. The Velkari crisis officer, who had not yet spoken, said very quietly, "It tells us that the outer corridor is not the last thing you will build." No, I said. It is not. Oren folded his hands. Commander, I want to ask directly, what does Earth intend? I had been waiting for that question since the session recess. Earth intends to respond, I said. I cannot give you operational specifics, because they are not being shared with me through diplomatic channels at this stage. What I can tell you is what a state of total mobilization means in practical terms, because Earth invoked that designation approximately 4 hours after the strikes. I pulled up a secondary file on the datapad. The last time that designation was used was the 22nd century, a conflict that ended with a permanent restructuring of Earth's global governance. Total mobilization means every manufacturing facility, every commercial shipyard, every civilian logistics corridor is legally redirected to military production. It is not a posture. It is a commitment. Oren was quiet. I told them about George Calloway. I told them about Nora Lang, the schoolteacher who had organized 2,000 children into a shelter procedure in the minutes after the strike and stayed to help with emergency response until a secondary structural failure took her. I told them about Den Okafor, who had improvised an airlock connection in a debris field using non-standard parts from his own ship's hull because the alternative was leaving 800 people to run out of air. I told them 3 names, and I told them those names plainly, without drama, the way you tell someone a fact you need them to hold on to. 300,000 people died on Kepler Station when the life support failed, I said. That number is confirmed as of this morning. It will likely increase as access to the outer sections is restored. The Velkari officer had not moved. The collective, I said, believed that targeting civilian settlements rather than military assets would demonstrate capability without directly engaging our navy. It was, from a certain strategic perspective, a considered choice. It was built on the assumption that we would receive the message, calculate the cost of resistance, and choose negotiation from a weakened position. I looked at Oren. We are not negotiating from a weakened position, I said. We are not negotiating at all, yet. What we are doing is responding, and the Senate should understand the difference between those two things. Oren said, after a long pause, what would it take for humanity to come to the table? Acknowledgement, I said. A real one. Not a diplomatic framing. Not a settlement offer attached to a framework that treats the deaths as a line item. Acknowledgement that people were killed who should not have been. That their names are real. That the entity responsible for the decision to target them understands what it cost. I paused. Without that, there is no shared starting point. And without a shared starting point, there is no table. Dolan looked like he had something to say and was choosing not to say it. Oren looked like he had several things to say and could not determine the right order. I stood, which ended the conversation politely. I will be here, I said. I appreciate the observation arrangement. The fountain in the garden is very pleasant. They left. I went back to the window and watched the water move and thought about 4 million people breathing carefully in a sealed station, and about a fleet that was not stopping, and about the particular silence that falls in a room when everyone in it realizes that a situation has moved past the point where standard procedure applies. That kind of silence has a texture. I had learned to recognize it. It had filled the Senate chamber yesterday. It was about to fill it again. The emergency full session was called 38 hours after the original address. All 41 member species, full gallery, every seat occupied. I had attended full sessions before. They were called 4 or 5 times a year for genuinely significant matters. I had never seen the chamber so completely full that the auxiliary upper ring platforms had standing room crowds pressed against the railings. Counselor Oren gave me the central podium. Not the observation tier. Not the glass-paneled balcony that humanity had been assigned as its designated speaking position since our admission to the Senate. The central podium on the floor level, where full member delegates stood when they addressed the body. He had arranged it quietly the night before, through his chief of staff, with a note that said only, "I believe the Senate needs to see you at floor level today." I had read the note 3 times. Then I had thanked him, and gone to sleep, and woken up 4 hours later and prepared. Commander Voss, Oren said, from his position at the Senate President's chair, the body recognizes humanity's unique role in the current situation and grants an open address. No time limit has been set. I stood at the podium and looked at 419 delegates for a long moment before I said anything. "I am not going to speak about the strikes themselves," I said. "You know what happened. I am going to talk about what is happening right now, and what will happen, and I am going to be as direct as I am capable of being, because I believe this body has had enough comfortable language for one session." The chamber was absolutely still. I had heard full chamber sessions with the ambient sound of 400 beings shifting and murmuring and consulting through earpieces. This was not that. This was a room that had decided to listen. "Earth's fleet is currently operating in the outer corridor," I said. "As of 6 hours ago, 4 of the 18 settlements have been secured and resupply corridors are active. The remaining 14 settlements have defensive perimeters established. Dravri forces in the region have pulled back approximately 12 light minutes from their farthest advance point." I activated the holographic display above the podium, a 3-dimensional projection of the outer corridor system, fleet positions marked in human blue and Dravri silver. "This is our current deployment," I said, indicating the blue signatures. "This is not our maximum capacity. This is not close to our maximum capacity. This is what we had positioned within rapid response range prior to the strikes occurring, assets already in transit, already on patrol rotation, already assigned to corridor security." I paused. "I want to show you what the next 30 days look like." I switched to a second projection. A rising graph line, steep and continuous, marked along the horizontal axis in day increments. This is projected human fleet expansion under total mobilization. The vertical axis is commissioned warship equivalents. This point, I indicated day 30, is where our production output crosses the current registered total capacity of the Dravri military fleet. The murmur that moved through the gallery was not the polite murmur of diplomatic acknowledgement. It was the murmur of people doing arithmetic in their heads and not liking what the numbers said. "I am not presenting this as a threat," I said, before the murmur could become something louder. "I am presenting it because several members of this body have been operating on the assumption that humanity's response would be proportional, that we would deploy a reply force, demonstrate our seriousness, and then enter negotiation from a stable position. I want to correct that assumption before it shapes any decisions made in this chamber." The Dravri secondary diplomat, Ron, rose from his seat on the floor. He was young for a diplomatic role, and he looked it, not from inexperience exactly, but from the particular strain of someone who had been handed a crisis that his rank was not designed for. "Commander Voss, the collective is prepared to discuss a resolution framework at the earliest opportunity." "I know," I said. "I have received 3 communication requests from Dravri Command in the past 14 hours. I have not responded." Ron's 4 eyes shifted. "May I ask why not?" "Because responding requires both parties to agree on what they are responding to," I said. "The collective's position frames the strikes as a territorial action that exceeded its intended parameters. Humanity's position is that this was an unprovoked attack on civilian infrastructure that killed 300,000 people and endangered 4 million more." I looked at Ron steadily and without aggression. "Those are not the same conversation. We cannot negotiate across that gap until we agree which conversation we are having. Ron sat down. Counselor Peth raised her hand. She was the Velkari defense minister, and she had the composed manner of someone who had spent a career delivering clear assessments to people who preferred to hear soft ones. Oren nodded to her. Commander Voss, Peth said, I want to ask something that I suspect several of us are considering. Humanity's projection capacity is significant. We accept that. But the current military situation involves immediate risk, not future projections. The Dravery fleet, in its present posture, still represents a substantial threat to human assets in the corridor. She paused. Does that not give Earth reason to temper the response? To find a middle position? I thought about how to answer that. Not about what to say, I knew what to say. About how to say it so that it reached her properly. Counselor Peth, I said, if the Velkari homeworld were struck. If a foreign military destroyed your life support infrastructure and left 4 million of your civilians in a sealed environment, running out of breathable air, with no rescue coming. What would your people do? Peth did not hesitate. We would respond. Knowing the cost in advance. Yes. Even if the response involved significant risk to your own forces. Yes. Then you already understand the answer to your question, I said. The difference is that the Velkari have never been in that position, and neither have most of the species in this room. Your conflicts have escalation limits. Established frameworks. Both sides understand the ceiling before the first engagement occurs. I looked across the full gallery. Humanity spent 2,000 years of recorded history on a single planet, fighting every form of conflict that exists between beings who share a world and cannot leave it. We did not always have off-ramps. We did not always have ceilings. What we developed, over that time, was the understanding that the only reliable protection for the people you care about is your willingness to stand between them and whatever threatens them, and to keep standing. A delegate near the center of the floor, the representative from the Murith Collective, a species that had publicly criticized human expansion policies in formal Senate communications on 14 separate occasions, was looking at me with an expression I had not seen from them before. Not hostility. Not condescension. Something closer to recalibration. We are not reckless, I said. I want this body to understand that clearly. We value life. Every life, human, Dravery, every species seated in this room. We are not looking to destroy a civilization. What we are doing, and what we will continue to do, is responding to an attack on civilian populations with everything we are able to bring to bear, for as long as it is necessary, because 300,000 people are dead and we know every single one of their names. The elder Asha of the Ledhani delegation had not moved since the session began. She was a small, pale-skinned woman who had represented her people's pacifist tradition in this body for longer than I had been alive. She had never once spoken during an open session in my entire tenure as liaison. The Ledhani communicated primarily through written submissions, which they considered more considered than spoken address. She raised her hand. Oren looked surprised enough that he took a moment to acknowledge her. Elder Asha, the body is honored. Asha stood very slowly. She was old enough that standing took something from her. When she spoke, her voice was so quiet that the chamber's acoustics had to work to carry it, and the room went completely still to help them. I want to say something, she said, that I perhaps should have said at an earlier time. The room waited. My people have not raised a weapon in 4,000 years, she said. We believe, with great sincerity, that the preservation of life is the foundation of all meaningful civilization. This belief has guided every position we have taken in this body since our admission. She paused. I have watched this body treat the human liaison as a representative of a species that has not yet earned full consideration. I have watched resolutions pass that limited human access, restricted human development corridors, framed human expansion as a problem to be managed rather than a development to be engaged with honestly. Her eyes moved to the Dravery delegation. I have also watched the Dravery Collective stand at this podium and describe the deliberate destruction of civilian life support infrastructure as a necessary correction. Her voice did not rise. I want to be direct. What humanity is doing in the outer corridor is not aggression. It is the defense of people who were attacked. The difference between those two things matters enormously, and I regret that this body has not been clearer about that difference from the moment the session began yesterday. She sat down. The room stayed quiet for longer than any recess bell. I stepped back from the podium for a moment and looked out at the chamber, at 419 delegates from 41 species, and the specific quality of silence that fills a room when something true has been said by someone who rarely speaks, and everyone present knows it. I returned to the podium. I have 2 things left to say, I said. The first is about the path forward. The second is about something else. The path forward was straightforward. The framework was already prepared. Full restoration of all 18 settlements. Military withdrawal and monitored buffer zone. Independent verification through the Senate's own Oversight Commission. I outlined it in plain terms, without embellishment, the way you read a list of facts that do not require interpretation. Then I told them about George Calloway's irrigation network. I told them about Nora Lang and the 2,000 children. I told them about Den Okafor and the 800 people who were alive because he did not accept that something could not be done. I told them about a 14-year-old girl named Alice Porter who had been studying for her secondary exams on Kepler Station when the strike occurred and who had spent the next 6 hours talking younger children through breathing exercises to conserve oxygen while adults worked on emergency systems, because she had read about emergency protocols in a book for her biology class and it was the only useful thing she could think of to do. I told them Alice Porter was alive. I told them what she had done in those 6 hours. I told them she was 14. The chamber was a long way from applause. We know the names, I said. All of them. We will always know them. That is not a threat, and it is not sentiment. It is simply what we are. We carry our history the way some species carry their young, close to the body, carefully, because losing it means losing part of what we are. I stepped back from the podium. The Senate will vote, I said. Whatever you vote, we will be here tomorrow. And we would very much prefer, going forward, to be here as partners. I walked back to the observation tier and sat in my chair. Oren called for a short recess, and in the recess, I counted the number of delegates who were speaking quietly to each other and the number who were not speaking at all, and I tried to read the difference. The vote was called 2 hours later. Full Tier 1 diplomatic status for humanity, 39 in favor, 2 opposed. The 2 opposed were small client states aligned with the Dravery Collective, and both of them, before the session formally closed, had filed preliminary requests for normalized bilateral relations with Earth. Councillor Oren caught my eye from across the chamber as the final count was confirmed. He gave me a short, deliberate nod. I returned it. Outside the chamber, in the corridor, secondary diplomat Ron was waiting. He looked very young in the corridor lighting. Commander Voss, he said. The collective would like to formally request a private consultation with your delegation as soon as possible. Tell Consul Harith I will be available tomorrow morning, I said. Ron hesitated. Consul Veth has been recalled, he said. Consul Harith is the acting lead. I know, I said. Tomorrow morning. I walked back to my quarters, and the fountain was still running in the garden below, and the stars above Velkara Prime were very bright, and somewhere along the outer corridor, a human fleet was holding its position and waiting, the way we had always been very good at waiting when we knew something was not finished yet. The meeting room was small and functional. A table, 6 chairs, 2 glasses of water on a plain tray, no recording indicators on any wall surface. That last detail was the Dravery High Consul's one stated condition, communicated through his aide the night before. No official record. Just 2 people in a room. His name was Consul Harith, and he was a different kind of Dravery official from Consul Veth. Where Veth had been theatrical, Harith was contained. His silver skin had the duller finish of age, and his 4 eyes moved slowly, with the kind of assessment that comes not from suspicion but from a long practice of noticing things accurately. He had been in diplomatic service for 40 years. You could see it in the way he carried his own weight, not heavily, but deliberately, as though he had learned that every movement costs something and it is worth deciding what you spend. He arrived with 12 armed escorts, who remained outside the closed door. I arrived alone. Harith noticed immediately. He said nothing about it for the first several seconds, simply settling into his chair and arranging his hands on the table, a Dravery gesture of neutral intent, both palms visible. You have no security, he said finally. I have no need for it, I said, and sat across from him. He looked at me for a moment with the expression of someone filing that statement away for later consideration. I requested this meeting, he said, because I believe there is still a path available that does not require further loss of life on either side. The collective is a rational civilization. Rational civilizations find resolution frameworks. That is what they do. I agree with that principle, I said. What framework did you have in mind? A formal ceasefire, to begin immediately. Senate arbitration to establish new territorial parameters for the outer corridor, with both parties presenting their historical claims. Reparations to be calculated by a joint committee, with a payment schedule agreed over a period to be determined. Withdrawal of human fleet assets from active engagement posture, with a reciprocal Dravery withdrawal to be verified by independent observers. He presented it cleanly, in the practiced way of someone who had prepared the outline and rehearsed the delivery. I waited until he was finished before I said anything. Consul Harith, I said. May I ask you something that is not about the framework? Of course. How long has the Dravery Collective had spaceflight? He paused slightly. Approximately 6,000 years. In that time, how many conflicts has the collective engaged in with other spacefaring species? Harith considered. A number of engagements. The historical record includes several significant territorial disputes, and some smaller incidents. Most were resolved through Senate arbitration or bilateral negotiation. And in all of those engagements, I said, did you ever encounter a species that responded to a decisive first strike by advancing rather than withdrawing? Harith was quiet. I want to understand something, I said, and my voice was still even, still without anger, because anger was not useful here and I had decided to be useful. The operation against the outer corridor settlements was carefully planned. I can see the operational logic, civilian targets rather than military assets, because targeting civilians sends a message without directly engaging our navy. Territory with historical Dravery significance, which provides a legal framework for the action. Timing coordinated to maximize impact before Earth could respond in force. Harith said nothing. Which was its own kind of confirmation. It was built on an assumption, I said. I want to know what that assumption was. Harith's 4 eyes were steady on me. He made a decision and answered honestly. We assumed that a rational civilization, confronted with a significant demonstration of force against non-military targets, would calculate the cost of continued engagement and choose negotiation. Yes, I said. That is a reasonable assumption. I paused. For a rational species, I said. Harith's expression did not change. But something behind his eyes shifted slightly. Consul Harith, I said, can I tell you about a man named George Calloway? Who is George Calloway? He was 63 years old. He came to the outer corridor from Earth when he was 22, as part of a land grant settlement program. He spent 41 years building an irrigation system on Kepler Station that eventually fed 2 million people across 3 settlements. He was not an engineer by training, he had been a general laborer on Earth. He taught himself hydrology from archived textbooks and built the first water distribution network on Kepler by hand, with a crew of 11 volunteers, before any formal infrastructure funding reached the outer systems. Harith was watching me without expression. His wife's name is Dorothy, I said. They met on Kepler 6 years after he arrived. They had 4 children. 2 of those children also lived on Kepler at the time of the strike. George died in the first 12 hours after your collective hit the station's power grid, when the water pressure in the sealed sections failed and the recycling network he had spent 4 decades building went offline for the first time in its history. I said it the same way I said everything else. Without theatrics. Just the fact, set on the table like an object that has weight. Dorothy was evacuated by a rescue shuttle in the second wave of the human response. She is currently receiving care on a medical ship near the corridor boundary. Her 2 children survived. I paused. One of them is a man named Paul Calloway. He is 31 years old. He works in agricultural management, the same as his father. I spoke to him briefly through a relay channel before coming to this meeting. Harith did not move. Paul told me that his father used to say that the outer corridor would one day feed half the galaxy, if people were patient enough and worked hard enough. George Calloway genuinely believed that. He spent 41 years living inside that belief, building something that proved it was not naive. I looked at Harith. Paul also told me that he intends to go back, I said. As soon as the restoration framework allows re-entry. He is going to rebuild his father's irrigation network. He said he knows where all the original schematics are stored. Haritha's hands were very still on the table. We keep records, I said. Not as bureaucratic function. As a practice. We record what people built and why they built it. We record what was destroyed and who destroyed it. We teach those records to our children, and our children teach them to their children, and the record does not degrade over time. It becomes more detailed. I understand, Harith said quietly. I do not believe you do yet, I said. Not fully. But I want you to. I reached into my jacket pocket and set a data card on the table. 314,000 records. Names, ages, biographical summaries. Every confirmed loss from the Kepler station event. We compiled it in 48 hours. Every entry is verified against personal records, census data, and family confirmation where family members are accessible. I left the card on the table. That card does not contain statistics, I said. It contains people. And the people who love them know the names on it, and the communities they came from know the names on it, and Earth knows the names on it, and we are going to keep knowing them. Harith looked at the card. He did not touch it. What does Earth require? He asked. His voice was quieter than it had been at the start of the meeting. Restoration, I said. Complete and verified restoration of all 18 settlements. Every structure rebuilt. Every infrastructure system repaired or replaced. Every supply corridor restored to pre-strike functionality. Funded entirely by the Dravery Collective, with independent Senate verification of completion timelines. And militarily. Full withdrawal to pre-strike positions. A monitored buffer zone of not less than 30 light-years along the outer corridor boundary. No Dravery fleet assets permitted within that zone without advance notification to the Senate and explicit approval. And the territorial status of the corridor itself is not a question, I said. Human settlers developed those worlds over 60 years. Human families live on those worlds. Human people died defending and rebuilding those worlds. The territorial status was established when the first survey team arrived and the first family decided to stay. It is not available for renegotiation. Harith absorbed this. Then he said, what you are describing contains no concession to the collective's position. The original concern, the pace and extent of human expansion, is not addressed. No, I said. It is not. Then why would the collective agree? I looked at him for a long moment. Because the original concern is legitimate, I said, and I watched him register the surprise of that. Human expansion is fast. It will continue to be fast. We are a young civilization with a great deal of energy and curiosity and need for space, and we are going to keep moving outward. That is a real thing for the collective to have concerns about, and those concerns can be addressed through diplomacy, through negotiated corridor agreements, through the exact kind of patient engagement that this Senate exists to facilitate. I kept my hands flat on the table. What cannot be addressed through diplomacy, after the fact, is attacking civilians to make a political point. That is a door you cannot unopen. You cannot negotiate your way back to the moment before it. Haritha's hands shifted slightly. Not nervously. Thoughtfully. The framework I have outlined, I said, is the framework in which the Dravery Collective continues to exist as a full spacefaring civilization in 50 years. I am not speaking abstractly. I am telling you, honestly, that this is the version of the next 5 decades in which your civilization is intact. The alternative version exists, and I would prefer that neither of us has to live in it. You speak as though humanity's capability in the alternative version is certain, Harith said. I speak as though humanity's commitment in the alternative version is certain, I said. Capability is a projection. Commitment is a choice already made. Harith picked up the data card. He turned it over once. Set it back down, but not away from him. He left it near his side of the table. I need to consult with the senior council, he said. Of course. The fleet posture in the interim. Current position maintained. No advance. No additional withdrawal. We are not escalating. We are also not pretending the situation is resolved. Harith stood. I stood with him. He was taller than me by a significant margin, and he looked at me across the table with the expression of a being who has spent 40 years understanding how conflicts resolve and has just spent an hour with something that does not fit cleanly into any of the categories he uses. "Commander Voss," he said, "I have one question that is separate from the negotiation." "Go ahead." "You came to this meeting alone. No security. No backup communication. No contingency." He paused. "Is this confidence, or something else?" I thought about it honestly. "It is experience," I said. "I have been in this building for 11 years, and in that time I have had a number of conversations that could have gone badly in various ways. None of them did, because the beings I was speaking to were not irrational, they were operating inside frameworks that did not account for certain things. This conversation is similar." I picked up my data pad. "You are not a threat to me in this room, Consul Harith. You are a person trying to find a way out of a situation that your predecessor created, and you are doing it honestly, and I respect that." I walked to the door. "Tomorrow morning," I said. "Full session. I will see you there." "One more thing," Harith said. I stopped. "Is it possible," he said, "for humanity to accept that the collective did not intend the civilian losses to be as significant as they were? That the operational planning did not fully account for the dependency of life support on the primary power grid?" I turned back and looked at him. "Consul Harith," I said, "I believe you. I believe that the full scope of the outcome was not intended. And I want you to know that it does not matter." I said it gently, because it was a hard thing to say and it deserved to be said carefully. 314,000 people are not less dead because the decision that led to their deaths did not specifically target them. We are not going to grade the intention against the outcome. We are going to hold the outcome to account, and we are going to do it through the framework, and we are going to do it for as long as it takes. I opened the door. "Tomorrow morning," I said again. And I walked back down the corridor alone, past the 12 armed escorts who watched me go, and none of them said anything, and I did not look back. The full Senate reconvened at 0900 Standard Time. I had slept 5 hours, which was more than I had managed the night before, and I felt the difference in the clarity of everything around me, the corridors, the garden light, the voices of the security staff who passed me on the way to the chamber. 5 hours of sleep after 2 days of sustained tension is a kind of luxury you only fully appreciate when you have it. Consul Harith was already in the Dravery delegation area when I arrived. He had the data card I had given him in his jacket. I noticed it because the card created a slight rectangular outline against the fabric, and I had learned, over 11 years, to notice outlines. Counselor Oren opened the session with formal language, a motion to consider a complete resolution of the outer corridor situation in all its diplomatic, legal, military, and humanitarian dimensions. The motion passed 38-3, the same 3 client states casting the same votes they had cast at every opportunity, performing loyalty that had become too expensive to examine honestly. I was given the central podium again. Oren had arranged it the same way as the previous session, no announcement, no ceremony, just the simple fact of the position made available. I had come to understand that this was his way of acting without leaving a paper trail. He was a careful man, and I had grown to appreciate careful men. "Thank you, Counselor," I said. "I will be brief this morning." The chamber was full. Not quite the same electric tension as the day before, something had shifted overnight. Not relief, exactly. More like the quality of a room where the heaviest question has been asked and people are waiting to hear whether the answer is going to be endurable. "I have met with Consul Harith of the Dravery Collective," I said. The meeting was productive. The collective has agreed, in principle, to the full restoration framework I outlined in the previous session. Complete rebuilding of all 18 settlements, funded by the collective, verified by Senate observers. Military withdrawal and 30 light-year buffer zone. Independent Oversight Commission to monitor compliance. The murmur that moved through the gallery was different from the one that had followed the fleet projection. This one had the quality of release, not happiness, but the specific sound a room makes when something that was tightly wound begins, carefully, to loosen. "I want to acknowledge Consul Harith directly," I said. He came to a difficult situation that his predecessor created. He came honestly. He asked hard questions and he listened to the answers, and he did not try to reframe what happened into something more comfortable than it was. That is not a small thing in a diplomatic context, and I want the Senate to note it. Harith, from his seat on the floor, was expressionless in the careful way of someone working very hard at it. I also want to address this body on a matter that is separate from the immediate resolution, I said. And I want to ask for the Senate's patience while I do. I looked across the full gallery. 41 species. 419 delegates. A room that had been making decisions about humanity for 11 years while I sat in a glass-paneled balcony on the left side of the gallery and watched. 22 of the species represented in this room, I said, have voted at various points in the past decade in favor of motions that limited human expansion corridors. 14 have formally registered diplomatic concern about the rate of human development in the outer systems. 6 have described humanity, in official Senate communications, as a potential destabilizing presence in the galactic community. A very particular silence. I raise this not to assign blame, I said. I raise it because I think we need to be honest about the environment in which the Dravry Collective decided that attacking our settlements was a viable strategy. That decision was not made in a vacuum. It was made in a Senate culture that had spent years signaling, through votes and resolutions and diplomatic language, that humanity was a junior species whose growth could be managed, redirected, or slowed by external pressure. No one was moving. I understand why those votes were cast, I said. I do. We are fast. We are loud. We take up space quickly. We have not always been easy partners. But I want this body to understand something about the word junior, as it has been applied to us. I paused. Junior means newer, I said. It does not mean smaller. It does not mean less capable, or less committed, or less willing to stand up for what we have built. It means we arrived recently. And in the time since we arrived, we have demonstrated, I think clearly enough, that recently does not mean temporarily. The Murith representative was looking at his desk surface. I could not tell if he was thinking or avoiding. We want to be partners, I said. I want to be absolutely clear about that. We have always wanted to be partners. We have been sitting in that observation balcony for 11 years waiting for the invitation to come down to the floor, and we have not complained, because complaining is not our way of handling situations that require patience. Our way of handling situations that require patience is to be patient, and to build, and to keep being here. I looked at Elder Asha, who was watching me from the Lethani section with her hands folded and her expression entirely open. Elder Asha said something yesterday that I have been thinking about since she said it, I said. She said that defending ordinary people is not aggression. It is care. I paused. She was right. And I want to build on that, if I can. What I said next took some time. I had not planned all of it in advance. Some of it came from the room, from the specific quality of attention in the chamber, from the sense that this was a moment that had been waiting for certain words and I was the only person in a position to say them. I told them about the history of human conflict, not as a warning, but as a context. I told them about the centuries of wars on a single planet, wars between people who shared languages and customs in the same stretch of ocean, wars that had seemed, from inside them, like they might never end. I told them about the mechanisms we had built, painfully and at great cost, to prevent those wars from continuing, institutions, laws, agreements, the gradual and imperfect construction of frameworks for resolving disagreement without burning everything down. I told them that we had built those frameworks because we had experienced what happens when they do not exist. We had lived inside that experience for 2,000 years. We were not naive about what conflict costs. We were the species in this room that was the least naive about it. We did not come to galactic space as conquerors, I said. We came as settlers. As explorers. As people who needed room. The outer corridor worlds were not taken from anyone, they were found empty, and we put our families in them, and grew food in them, and built schools and hospitals and irrigation systems and argued about local governance and raised children who had never seen Earth and thought of those worlds as home. I looked at the Dravry delegation. I want the collective to understand something that I believe Consul Harith already understands, I said. You did not attack a military installation. You did not attack a strategic asset. You attacked homes. You attacked the place where a man spent 41 years of his life building something that fed 2 million people. And what you found, when you did, was that humanity does not have a category for acceptable losses when the losses are children and farmers and school teachers. Harith was looking at the table in front of him. That is not irrational, I said. It is not a failure of calculation. It is a value. A choice, made long ago and not reversed since. The people in those settlements were not acceptable losses. They were not a negotiating position. They were people, and we were going to come for them, and we came. I looked away from the Dravery delegation and addressed the full chamber again. The restoration framework will proceed, I said. The Senate's Oversight Commission will verify compliance. The buffer zone will be monitored. And when the settlements are rebuilt, every structure, every system, every corridor and school and hospital, the people who live in them will be informed of what happened, and they will be informed of who is responsible for the reconstruction, and they will make their own decisions about what that means. I reached into my jacket pocket and removed my data pad one final time. George Calloway's irrigation schematics, I said, have been archived by the Earth Historical Preservation Office. His son Paul has a copy. When the Kepler station restoration is complete, Paul Calloway intends to rebuild the network his father designed. He told me it will take approximately 3 years. I told him I would make sure the Senate was aware of the timeline. I set the data pad down on the podium. I would like this body to make a note of that timeline, I said. In 3 years, the water will run again on Kepler station. I would like someone to be watching when it does. I stood back from the podium. Councillor Oren called the formal vote an hour later, after a short recess during which the chamber did not have the sound of 400 beings consulting with their staff and adjusting their positions. It had the sound of 400 beings sitting very quietly with their own thoughts. The vote on the restoration framework passed unanimously. All 41 member species in favor. The vote on human Tier 1 diplomatic status, 39-2, the two being the same client states, performing the only loyalty they had left. The vote on an independent review commission to evaluate how Senate culture and historical voting patterns had contributed to conditions that made the Dravery strikes possible, 33-8, with 8 abstentions. It was not a comfortable vote for the 8 who opposed it. I did not expect them to be comfortable. I expected them to be honest eventually, and the commission would give them a structured way to get there. Oren confirmed the final count and formally closed the special session. The chamber filled with movement, delegates rising, staff gathering materials, the ordinary sound of a room returning to its normal rhythms after something extraordinary had passed through it. Elder Asha crossed the floor to where I was standing near the base of the observation tier stairs. She moved slowly, with the careful pace of someone who has learned that arriving matters more than arriving quickly. She stopped in front of me and looked up at me with clear, very old eyes. "Commander Voss," she said. "Elder Asha. I have been in this chamber for 23 years, she said. I have heard many addresses from this podium. Some of them were important. Some were necessary. Some were both," she paused. "Yours was both." "I appreciate that," I said. "May I ask you something?" "Of course." "The young woman," she said. "Alice Porter. The 14-year-old who led the breathing exercises." "Yes." "Will she come back?" "To Kepler Station, when it is rebuilt." I thought about that. "I honestly don't know," I said. "She might. Or she might decide that some places carry too much weight to go back to. That is her choice to make," I paused. "I hope she does." I think George Calloway would have liked knowing that a 14-year-old with a biology textbook kept 2,000 children calm in the dark. Asha smiled, very slightly. It changed the whole quality of her face. "Yes," she said. "I think so too." She turned and walked, slowly and steadily, back to the Lethani section. Councillor Oren approached me a few minutes later, after the room had thinned. He was carrying his session notes under one arm and had the look of someone who had not slept well but was not planning to complain about it. "Commander Voss," he said. "On behalf of the Senate, I want to say, formally, that the body's handling of the initial session was inadequate. You should not have been in that balcony. You should not have been in that balcony for 6 years." "No," I said. "We should not have been." "That changes today," he said. "Effective with the Tier 1 designation." "I know," I said. "Thank you, Counselor." He nodded, once, with the efficiency of a man who has many more conversations to have before the day is over, and walked away. I stood in the emptying chamber for a few minutes longer. Not because there was anything left to do there. Just because I wanted to stand on that floor, in that space, and let it be ordinary for a moment. The chamber was just a room when it was empty. High ceiling, good acoustics, carefully maintained stone floor. A room where things got decided. We had a seat in it now. I went back to my quarters and opened the comm terminal. I wrote a message, addressed to the Earth Diplomatic Corps, not any specific person, just the General Archive. The message was 4 sentences. Resolution achieved. Restoration framework in place. Floor access granted. We are here. I sent it. Then I sat by the window and watched the garden below, where the fountain was running in the late afternoon light, and the Valkyrie maintenance staff were moving quietly along the paths, and a single bird, some local creature I had never learned the name of, small and pale, with a very precise way of landing, touched down on the edge of the fountain, considered the water for a moment, and flew away. Somewhere beyond the building, beyond the planet, beyond the carefully mapped systems of the galactic community, a human fleet was turning around. Not retreating. Not withdrawing in defeat. Simply completing a task and heading home, because home was the thing we had always been defending, and it was still standing, and the people in it were going to be all right. I closed my eyes for a moment and thought about Paul Calloway, on a medical ship near the corridor boundary, with a set of irrigation schematics in his data archive and 3 years of work ahead of him. The water would run again. We always came back. That was the thing the galaxy was going to have to learn to account for, not just our capacity, not just our speed, but the simple, unshakable fact that we came back. To the places we had built, to the people we had lost, to the work that had been interrupted. We came back and we picked it up again and we kept going, because that was what the people who had come before us had done, and what the people who came after us would do. We remembered everything. We forgot nothing. And we never, ever stopped. The fountain ran on in the garden below, and the stars above Valkara Prime were beginning to appear in the darkening sky, and in a room somewhere in the Senate complex, a data card with 314,000 names on it was sitting in the breast pocket of a Dravery diplomat's jacket, and he was going to carry it home, and I thought that was probably the most important thing that had happened today. Not the vote. Not the floor access. Not the commission. The fact that Consul Harith had taken the card. The fact that he had not left it on the table. I sat with that for a while, and let myself believe it was enough to start with.